Hello, Singapore Art Week. It's so beautiful to be here with you today talking about poetry in Afghanistan. As an Afghan, I've had a deep appreciation for poetry from a young age. It's a big part of my culture and we take it very seriously. Today, I'm going to get into how social issues have impacted the use of poetry, both in my country and in our culture. But first, I'm going to start with a story, a conversation I had years ago with a beloved uncle of mine. And he was talking to me about two things he believes have changed irreversibly: love and poetry. Love, Yelda. Love used to be seeing a woman with a red scarf on her head on a different hilltop of a different village, and you'd have to find her and you'd have to court her and put in so much effort. Today, you can swipe left and right on love. شعر گفتن تغییر کرده. Poetry has changed. Poetry used to be a form of expression for those who didn't have freedom of speech. It was a creative solution. And so when you found poets talking about the rabbit and fox, they weren't talking about a rabbit or a fox. They were talking about social issues. They were talking about classism and corruption, politics and poverty, and so forth. You didn't have to be educated to be a poet. In fact, most poets were uneducated, and the more educated you were, you'd find yourself in prison. Afghan poetry has always played a large role in our resistance, from occupation to civil war to the Taliban and Soviet regimes. Poetry's disguised political messages. During the Soviet regime, you found that poetry groups no longer met in public, and most actually stopped publishing their work out of fear of persecution. During the Taliban regime, 15 out of 18 libraries were closed in Kabul, the capital city of Afghanistan. And in some cities, all the library books were destroyed. In the span of 1996 to 2001, those 5 years, it is believed that 80,000 books were destroyed. Afghan poetry is spiritual. It's filled with worship references. The Sufi spirit and traditions are deeply rooted in our poetry because Afghanistan has been home to sages and scholars for over 1,000 years. Most people have probably consumed Afghan, Sufi, Islamic poetry without even knowing it. Maulana Muhammad Jalaluddin Balkhi is the most translated poet in history. He's known for his poems about his devotion to God, and the Western world knows him as Rumi. In today's world of social media, you see 2.4 million posts. Most of his poems about his love for the divine have been compounded and translated into romantic poetry, love for a partner. His poetry, it took off because it was translated into English. As we know, English is one of the most valuable currencies that we share. And you have then poets like Hafiz, who most of the Western world likely has not heard about, although he's an equally, if not masterful poet. The reason you've probably not heard about him is because his work in even Farsi or Dari is so complex and layered that in countries like Afghanistan and Iran, there are university degrees offered for you to study Hafiz's work and become a scholar of his work. So if you've read Hafiz in the West, actually, most of the poems by Hafiz are not actually by Hafiz. They're by a white American poet named Daniel Ladinsky. I'm serious. Daniel Ladinsky has been publishing books under Hafiz for 2 decades. And I'm going to go off script and share that Daniel Ladinsky was not translating Hafiz's poems, and he had not studied Hafiz. He was simply publishing his own original work under the name of Hafiz, claiming that Hafiz had permitted him to do so in a dream that he had had. So these books becoming bestsellers is a perfect example of privilege. Omaid Safi says it was during the Victorian period that the Western readers would uncouple the mystical poetry from its Islamic roots, what he calls spiritual colonialism. Rumi and Hafiz are Muslims. They have made significant contributions to Islam. Rumi is known to have memorized the Quran, and Hafiz literally means he who has committed the Quran to heart. The erasure of Islam in their poetry is an act of violence. Not only has their identity been erased from their work, but the opportunity for readers and the Western world to connect with Islam through voices like Rumi and Hafiz, removing that opportunity is so tragic. These voices filled with mercy and harmony and love. And on the contrary, with the Western world pushing voices like the Taliban and ISIS, voices that do not represent Islam, it's very damaging. And now I'm going to get actually into a high level understanding of gender roles and how they impact Afghan literature and the legacy of that literature and how it's affirmed in our daily culture. You should know that men are most valuable when they're honorable and they're courageous and they're proud. Women, on the other hand, they are most valuable when they're quiet and subservient and sacrificial. That brings me to the last poet I want to talk about today, Rabia Balkhi. She's a 10th century infamous Afghan poet. She's very, very celebrated in our culture, but the West doesn't know about her. And that's because she was imprisoned and killed by her brother for falling in love with a slave. Rabia Balkhi, she would write about love, a dishonorable, taboo topic, a forbidden topic for women even today in our culture. And it's said, as you can see in the visual here, that she wrote her last poem while she was imprisoned in a bathhouse with her own blood. There's a huge lack of representation around Afghan women's stories. And actually, that's bringing me into shifting gears into more modern diasporic poetry. I'm going to read today a poem that was published in 2020 about a pregnant Afghan refugee in the 1980s. She was being smuggled out of Afghanistan. The name of the poetry collection is Outlet. And the poem I'm reading is called It's Blood Coming. You should always have faith in God and the way he makes for you. You could never even fathom. If they know you're here, they will capture you. Go out and you'll be captured. So we went inside, taunted by people hollering at us. My husband had to pay them. We went to the office that made our passports. He changed our names and our ages. My brother was my son. I didn't like to lie to people, but we were supposed to lie. The man said to my husband, do not talk, just keep quiet. If they know where you're from, they don't let you go. We went to the smuggler's office. It was very small. 9 people were sleeping in there. All of us, my husband, me, my sister-in-law, my nephews, my children. Sometimes they didn't have electricity. They had no water. The Mujahideen was beside our room, and it was Ramadan. It was so hot. I was sick, like morning sickness. I couldn't eat anything. I was throwing up all the time. The night we were meant to leave, I got bleeding, all bleeding. I got a big cloth and I told my husband, I'm dying. I don't know. It's blood coming. Early morning, he went to the shops and found a doctor. She was very nice. She gave me medicine. It was like some kind of powder in newspaper. Okay, have this one. You'll be fine. I have a flight tonight. Can I go? No. If you go, you will lose the child or you will not survive. I prayed to God to save me. I had to go for the sake of my family. The bleeding stopped. This scene takes place in Pakistan in the 1980s, and the reason I know so many details of the poem is because this is my mother's story while she was pregnant with me, being smuggled out of Afghanistan. And as an Afghan woman, being able to write this piece is because of my freedom and my privilege. I'm highly aware of that, and I'm very grateful for it. That being said, stories that involve menstruation, pregnancy, very natural experiences for a woman are still considered shameful and inappropriate topics to discuss publicly. There's a thick veil between Afghan women's voices and the world. Most obviously, Afghan girls are not encouraged to go to school or even allowed to go to school. What this means is that there's a huge lack of published female poets in our culture. The domino effect of this invisibility is that Afghan women have only one narrative being pushed through Western media, right? It's the oppressed victim. On top of that, Afghan women have a harder time using their voices, even in Western societies. And between gender, language, religion, all of these barriers, there's a huge lack of representation of Afghan women's stories from Afghan women, our experiences, our creations, our history. So today I'm going to wrap up the session with a call to action that's very important to me. As people are waking up to the realities around Afghanistan, it is so mindful of how you can connect with a country and peoples that are being ethnically and linguistically cleansed off of the map. And it doesn't always have to do with donating and volunteering. It can simply start with consuming our stories and our art. How many Afghan artists do you have on your bookshelf? How many Afghan artists are on your Spotify playlists? How many Dari or Pashto translated films have you watched? There's a history here, and there are stories to be shared, and they are accessible. So I believe the advocacy that Afghans need most from allies like you is for you to humanize us through art, especially after decades of being dehumanized by the Western media. My name is Yaldo Ali, and I'm so thankful for having this space with you guys today. Khuda Hafiz.